Okay. For A1. Gufa. The Gemara for A1 on the first column on the first side. First column, about three-quarters down. Yeah, left side. Gufa. Rav Bibi Barabaye. Boyer Bir Barabaye. So what's the Gemara talking about? The Gemara is talking about if a guy went ahead on Shabbat and he forgot it was Shabbat. Now, I always say, do you ever forget your name? You don't forget your name, forget Shabbat. That's a problem. How do you forget that was Shabbat? Because he forgot it was Shabbat, he went ahead and got up early in the morning and he put some dough. He wanted to make some breakfast. Now, really, got to daven first before you eat. Got to pray first before you eat. That's supposed to eat breakfast before you daven, before you pray, right, Joe? Right, right, David? And he went ahead and he put some dough in the oven. He stuck dough in the oven. Now, the rabbis have said, in general, if a person, let's say Friday afternoon before Shabbat, he baked the dough, beautiful, but you're supposed to take that dough out of the oven. That dough that you stuck to the wall of the oven, you need to take that out before Shabbat, because if you don't take it out before Shabbat, the rabbi said you can't remove that dough that was stuck to the wall of the oven on Shabbat. Why can't you take out the dough that was stuck to the wall of the oven? Because either it's more of a weekday type of activity to scrape off to get the dough off, or the rabbis were concerned maybe if you're going to allow him to scrape off the dough on Shabbat, he might come to actually bake the dough on Shabbat. So the rabbis forbade a person in general for removing the dough that are stuck into the wall that's stuck into the wall. But what happened here, David, is not that he baked it before Shabbat and now he comes to the rabbi. Rabbi, I forgot to take out the dough. Can I take out the dough? Because the rabbi said you can't take out the dough. But here he put the dough in on Shabbat. Now, if he now and then, right, then we're going to see. Let's say he remembers, or someone else remembers right afterwards, and they realize, what did you do? You can't put dough in on Shabbat. I forgot. Or I didn't know the law. Can he now remove the dough? Because to violate the prohibition of baking is the only way it bakes. But if you remove it before it bakes, there was no violation of the act of baking. But if you remove it, you are violating the rabbinic prohibition of removing something from that's dough that's stuck to the wall of an oven. So do we allow him to violate the rabbinic prohibition to prevent that Torah violation of baking on Shabbat? And the case here was he did it unintentionally. He originally placed it in unintentionally. So that's because look at the Gemara now. Gufa, boy, is it clear, David, what the question is? Boy Rabivi Barabai. Hitvik pat betanu. If he attached bread into the oven and he did it on Shabbat unintentionally, did the rabbis permit him to remove that dough from that bread from the oven? Kodem yavo l'dechi of chatat, before he comes to the obligation of a korban chatat, a sin offering, Olohatiru, or they did not permit him. If they not permit him, that means he's not allowed to go ahead and remove it, and eventually it's going to bake what's it again? It's going to bake, and he's going to have to bring a korban chatat. He's going to have to go to the Beit HaMikdash and bring a sin offering for violating the Shabbat unintentionally. So those are the two sides of the coin. Amalei Rav Acha bar Abaye Ravina. Rav Acha bar Abaye says to Ravina, Hechi dami. What is the case? What's the case talking about? Ilema, if the guy unintentionally, unintentionally, he didn't know it was Shabbat, Vilo, or he forgot, he didn't know I'm not allowed to do this act. V'lo atkele, and he didn't remember before it was baked. So what's the question? Can he remove it? It can't remove it if he didn't remember. So it's obviously going to bake. Obviously, he had to remember. So, Manitiru, who are the rabbis permitting to remove the dough if he didn't? What's the possibility of allowing the guy to move the dough if he didn't know from the beginning until the baking that it was Shabbat? He's not gonna remove it. If he didn't know I can't do it, no question about removing it. He didn't know until it's already done deal. It was already baked. So you have to say Ella. You have to say Lav. You have to must say what happened was he put it into the oven, not knowing he's not allowed to do it, and then he remembered. He remembered what it's Shabbat. Remember that he remembered the law. Oh, by the way, I was not allowed to do that. Lav de David Ker. And he remembered. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, that he didn't know in the beginning, and he remembered before the actual baking was completed, that it was before it was baked. If you remember before it was baked, in order to bring a korban chatat, a sin offering, has to be unintentionally from the beginning to the end. If the baking, at the time the baking was done, the time that from the time you knew about it until the actual baking happened, so that was not unintentional at that point. You knew about it. So the Gemara says, "Mi mechayav." Would you be obligated a korban chatat, a sin offering under such a circumstance? For hatnan, we learned in the Mishnah, kol chayove chatot. Any person who does a sin unintentional and he brings a chatat, Ein chayavim, they're not obligated to bring a chatat, the sin of ashetei tchilatan, to the beginning, mishkaga, unintentional, v'sofo, and the end of the sin, not only the beginning of the sin, but the end was also unintentional, mishkaga. Only after the sin was completed was made known to him that he brings the korban chatat. So the guy who attached the dough in the oven unintentionally, if he remembered before it was baked, so it's not unintentional by the time that he's not going to be obligated to bring a korban chatat, the sin offering, because the end he knew that the bread was being baked in a prohibited way. So what is the question of Rab Bibi to say maybe we're not going to allow him to remove it, and he's going to come to bring a korban chatat, a sin offering. He's not going to bring a sin offering. If we're going to forbade him from removing the dough, he's not going to bring a sin offering because he knew about it before the bread was baked. So how can you tell me he's going to bring a sin offering? So again, if he willingly placed the dough in the oven, the process. So I said the Gemara is saying there should not be any penalty b'dei adam, meaning down here, sometimes a person does certain types of sins, the court doesn't give a punishment. Heaven will deal with it. And really what he needs to do, David, is do tshuva, is do repentance. So really the Gemara is saying the court won't kill the guy because he was unintentional. And not only they won't kill him because it was unintentional, he will not even have to bring a sin offering. So David asked, what is the punishment? The punishment is he has to repent. The Gemara says, let's say David, what happens? The guy goes ahead and you go to someone's property and you break the gate. As a result, you broke the gate, the animals went out and they were lost. So do you have to pay for those animals that were lost? So because you didn't directly cause the loss, you didn't actually damage the animals directly, you caused the animals to get lost. That's called a grama. So the Gemara says causing damage and not directly damage the person, he is exempt down here. The court, the rabbinic court won't obligate him he has to pay for the fence. If he would have hit the animal directly, he has to pay for the animal. But since he caused the damage, but not directly, so the Gemara talks about the idea maybe he'd be exempt from the court down here, but the court upstairs, he's responsible. So if he's a smart man, he would pay for it because you know what? It's better to pay it down here than to have to pay Right, he's not liable for something. Because there's something called, when it comes to damaging, there's something called direct, doing a direct damage to somebody. And now, because you broke the fence, now it could be that there might be differences if the animals would have definitely left, might be different than animals that could leave and couldn't leave, because there's something called, when you cause something and it's definite, that's called garmi. That there's certain laws that say then you would be obligated. We have to look in the exact halacha. But here, you knock down a fence. Not necessarily the animal's going to leave. Not necessarily the horse is going to leave when there's no fence. He might leave. He might not leave. This is his place of residence, right? The fact that you remove the fence doesn't necessarily mean he's going to run away. You could understand that a little better, right, David? Okay. But remember, like I said, David, it's worse. Good morning, Nathan. It's worse for a person not to deal with those, with the court, to leave an outstanding thing that the court upstairs is going to deal with. Nobody wants that. Now, if a person intentionally, let's say, started a sin, but at the end his hands were tied, and it was unintentionally by the time the end of the sin, or he was unintentional in the beginning and intentional at the end, he's not obligated a sin offering unless the whole sin from the beginning to the end was done unintentional. So the Gemara says as follows. It has to be, sorry, it has to be unintentional. In order for it to be chayav a sin offering, it has to be unintentional from the beginning to the end. But what kind of unintentional? He intended to do the act. It's not like a guy by mistake, you walk by on Shabbat and your elbow by mistake touches the light. You weren't intending for your elbow to. It's a good thing to have in your house. They call cover light covers, whatever they call. Those little covers that cover the switch, so you won't when you're walking. But if you go ahead and you touch that, you will not be obligated a sin offering, because you never intended to do that act. Correct, David? Correct, Nathan. You were only intending to walk, but when you intended to do this act, he intended to bake the bread, but he did not know he can't bake on Shabbat, or he did not know it was Shabbat. He forgot it was Shabbat. That's when he has to bring a sin offering, because why don't you know the law? Ignorance is not an excuse. Ignorance makes it that the court won't kill a guy. If a guy is ignorant in the law of Shabbat, he desecrates the Shabbat, or any law that he desecrates unintentionally, the court will not kill a guy, give lashes to anybody who does something unintentional. Lashes is only when he intentionally. To get lashes, you have to be warned and have witnesses in front of. You have witnesses. Guy is warned not kosher. You can't eat bacon, and he's warned, and there's witnesses. That's where you can get lashes. If he's not warned, no witnesses, no lashes. So the Gemara said, "Ela b'mezid." You have to say the case of Rabibi was that the guy went ahead and placed the dough in the oven. He stuck it in the oven intentionally, and then he realized, then he says, what am I doing? He was, let's say he was hungry, and he gave in to his temptation, and he stuck the dough in the oven. It stuck, and then he realized, he said, what am I doing? I'm being so foolish because I want to enjoy a piece of bread. I'm going to desecrate the Shabbat. So he says, I want to get my dough out. I want to get my dough out, but I know there's a rabbinic prohibition to remove dough that's stuck to an oven on Shabbat. But I don't want to be obligated a skila. I don't want to get. He doesn't want to get killed for such a thing. So he doesn't want to do an act that will be obligated skila. So that's the question: would we allow him to remove the item before it reaches the level of baking, and therefore he will not be subject to the death penalty? Or do we say no? We're not going to put to the side the rabbinic prohibition of removing the item, and now it will come out that he will be doing an act of baking on Shabbat. But now the Tosfos asks the obvious question: what do you if you're going to tell him not to remove it, he's going to get the obligated stoning. Is he going to listen to you? You can't expect. Tosfos says, what kind of question is that? It's obvious he's not going to listen to us if we forbade him to remove. Meaning he'll be happy to, he'll on his own would remove it to violate the rabbinic law. Good morning. Not to violate the biblical law of baking on Shabbat. Just want to remind me to say Birkat Hashach, the Birkat HaTorah before you said it. Beautiful. We're learning Masechet Shabbat. We have give choices. You could look in the Gemara, or you could do it early, whatever you. The Gemara is right here, and thank you for joining. Dalet Amin Aleph. Dalet Amin Aleph. 4A1 on the right side. Elabim Mezid. We're discussing the question. There was a Rabbi Bivi that had the following question. A guy went ahead and he stuck dough in an oven on Shabbat. A terrible thing. One of the malachot on Shabbat, he's not allowed to bake. It's one of the and he stuck the dough in on Shabbat. Now, in general, there's a rabbinic prohibition. If a guy stuck dough in before Shabbat, you have to take the dough that's stuck into the wall of the oven. You have to remove it before Shabbat. The rabbi said you can't leave that. If you want to use that dough on Shabbat, you can't scrape it out on Shabbat. Some say it's like a weekday type of activity, the scraping out. It's like, it's like you got a job, you got to call the handyman. You got to really scrape it out. It's attached to the wall of the oven. So the rabbi, that's how some learn. Others learn that maybe you might come to bake on Shabbat if you allow you to scrape it out. I think that's how Rambam learns. So there's a general rabbinic prohibition to remove the dough from a wall of an oven on Shabbat. But here, he actually put the dough in on Shabbat. And now the question to so could he remove it before it bakes? Now, the Gemara wants to know what is the case that we're talking about. Did he put it in unintentionally? Did he put the dough in on Shabbat unintentionally, not knowing it's Shabbat, forgetting it was Shabbat, or not knowing that or not knowing the law that you can't bake on Shabbat? But that was the Gemara first thought. The case of the question was when he did it unintentionally, and the Gemara at the moment moved away from that, and the Gemara is suggesting that the case is that he did it intentionally. He actually put the dough in on Shabbat intentionally, and do we allow him to remove the dough on Shabbat, which would violate a rabbinic law, in order to prevent him from violating the biblical law of baking on Shabbat? So it's true, it's a weekday activity to remove dough, let's say, from the wall of the oven, but which is a rabbinic prohibition, but if I leave it there, if he caught himself, or he had regret for doing that after he put it in, and now he intentionally placed it in, so should we push to the side the rabbinic prohibition in order to prevent the biblical violation, or not? Or we say, you know what? You were not careful. You were intentionally did it. You have to pay for your act, and we're not going to allow you to remove the dough. That was the other side of the coin. So Tosfos asked the question. If you look at the Tosfot, Kodam Sheyavol L'Dei Issa Skila, the Tosfot is the first Tosfot in the wide line, right? You have it? Tosfot says, V'im Tomah, if you're going to say, Ma boihi zu, what kind of question is it? Imitira l'dota, 118. If we allow him to remove the dough, it's obvious he will not listen to us if we forbade him to remove the dough because he doesn't want to get stoned. Because if he started, if he put it in intentionally, and if we're going to say don't remove it in order not to violate the rabbinic law, you think he's going to stand by and allow himself to, and he'll get stoned. So Riva says a beautiful answer. Tiritz Riva. Riva says, listen to this, David, you're going to enjoy it. Nathan, you'll enjoy it. Bimloa Tiru. If they did not allow him to remove the dough, he will not get skila. He will not get stoned for it, even though he placed the dough in intentionally. Why not? Because but his act was completed. But the fact that we tied his hands, Nathan, made him not able to remove the sin. He's not obligated a stoning when we stopped him from preventing him from getting. Is it clear, sir? What we're saying? The fact that if we would prevent him from removing this dough that's stuck in the oven, and as a result of us preventing him from removing the dough, it now has enough time to bake, which now it comes out he did the sin of baking on Shabbat intentionally, but it was only intentionally in the beginning. He wanted to remove it before the baking was done. So therefore, he will not be obligated death penalty for that. So when the Gemara says, but he didn't act, so what the Gemara means to say, if we would forbade him, that means that means a prohibition that would carry stila, that carries with it the death penalty, would be violated, but actually he will not be obligated because his hands were tied. Is it clear? Any question on that? Right. So that's what the Gemara. That's what Tosha says. Tirutziva, Tosha says, "Dimlo yitiru lo machayev skila." Would not be obligated skila. Kiva shemaniach ledusa, since he's refraining from removing it al yidei masha anu osrim lo. The fact that because we forbade him. Okay. Now let's continue in the Gemara. Back to the Gemara. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, but the Gemara says, Ela b'mezid, if you're talking about mezid, kodem sheyavu lidei isa skila mibayale. So the Gemara, Rabbivi's language was, if a guy placed dough in the oven on Shabbat, do we allow him to remove the dough before he comes to the obligation of chatat, of a sin offering? If his question was when he placed it intentionally, so it's not about a sin offering, it's about a possible sin that carries with it a death penalty of stoning. So you can't use the word if he placed it unintentionally that the Gemara originally thought. So therefore, it makes sense. The question is, could it remove before it comes to the possibility of a sin offering, which is for unintentional acts. But if you're telling me the case is an intentional act, it's not a sin offering. It's about a possible stoning sin. So that's what the Gemara shoots back. It should have said, it should have said before you come to the prohibition of skila. So what did the Gemara say? So the Gemara says, Omar of Shila, so Rav Shila says, La'olam b'shogeg. Really, it's talking about shogeg. Really, he placed it in the oven unintentionally. Now the Gemara had a question, and if he placed it into the oven unintentionally, so does he know about it? Now you told me, so who's asking the question? Could he remove it before it bakes? If he placed it unintentionally, if he's going to ask the question, we said the only time he will be obligated a sin offering is only if he does not know about, if it was unintentional from the beginning until the end. If he at any point knows about it before it was baked, he will not be obligated a sin offering. So the Gemara says he doesn't know about it. But you know what? Who knows? He placed it in the oven, but his friend was there. He stepped down, and his friend said, maybe I should remove it. Am I allowed to remove it? Am I allowed to remove it because I want to stop him from, should the friend remove it in order to prevent him
rabbinic prohibition
of removing though?
from
Correct. The friend has a rabbinic prohibition, but now should he push to the side of rabbinic prohibition in order to save his friend from a unintentional biblical violation? Because his friend placed the dough in unintentionally on Shabbat. If it stays there for a few minutes and it bakes, there will be a unintentional biblical violation of baking on Shabbat, a korban chatat, a sin offering. Should the friend step in and violate a rabbinic offering to prevent his friend from unintentionally violating a Torah law? That's the Gemara. Fascinating question. Now we do have responsibility. Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh. The question: how far does that obligation, responsibility go? You can make kiddush for me Friday night, even if you said kiddush, and now I walk into your house and David says, "Rabbi, very good, very good, very good." That's why I said, how far does that go? Perhaps that's part of the Gemara's question. I mean, to do a sin, does someone take the bullet or to do some sort of sin in order to prevent the other guy? That's what the Gemara is going to shoot back. Rav Sheshet says, "V'chi omrim lo la'adam." Do we tell a person, "Chatei, go ahead and chata sin kedei sheyischa chavercha"? Do we tell your friend? Do we tell somebody, you know what? I want you to sin, so the other guy doesn't get a more serious punishment? It can't be. We don't do that. The Rajba says the logic. It's a logical idea from Svara that there's no that a person should not be allowed. He says he shouldn't be allowed to violate a small prohibition in order to prevent his friend from. Now, I once saw years ago. I have to look it over where I remember seeing that there's an opinion. Maybe it's a Ritva. There might be opinion somewhere. We'll see more in Tosfos soon. Maybe that there might be a difference between what we will tell a person and what a person might be able to do on his own. The Gemara says, do we tell a person sin, do even a small sin, to prevent your friend from a big sin? But the question is, can a person on his own say, I on my own want to do a small sin to prevent my friend from a big sin? That might be a different story. We might not be able to tell you to do that, but you might have that ability to do it on your own. But that's a discussion. That's something to think about. You might hear the interesting nuance. Okay, the Rajba, the language that they quote the Rajba, his opinion seems to be like Nathan, because the way they quote him is logic is that there's no allowance to a person. Not that there's no allowance to a person to violate a light sin to save his friend from a more serious sin. But I'm just throwing up an idea that this has to be researched. Now Tosfos says there are exceptions. There are sometimes exceptions to this rule. And one of the things Tosfos says, there is sometimes like a mitzvah rabbah. Tosfos does say we find a situation that if a person is let's say you have someone who's an eved, a slave, right? And he's owned by two people, and one of the owners frees him. So now the slave becomes a chatzi eved. He's half free and half free and half slave, because one of his owners freed him, the other owner retained ownership. Now this slave is stuck. Why is he stuck? He can't marry a regular girl, regular Jewish girl, and he can't marry a shifra, a maidservant. Why not? Because the part of him that's Israel, that's free, can't marry a mamzeret. So he can't, because if he wants to marry a maidservant, meaning he can't, but if half that Jew can't marry a maidservant. If he wants to marry a regular Jew, the half of him that's a maid, that's a slave can't marry. He can't marry. Right, but exactly. So what does the Gemara say? He has to go ahead and we force the master to free that slave. That has that had half. Even though there is a law that says you're supposed to keep that slave, that he should not, you should not, you're not supposed to free that slave. But this, they have a Kanani part slave, but we say because of the mitzvah of pruvu to have children, which is a great mitzvah, which the part of him, which is a free part, has an obligation of having children. So we have mitzvah rabbah, some that level type of mitzvah. That sometimes we will tell the person to do a type of sin in order to enable that. For instance, the Gemara says, and obviously, I would just add to. If we mafkir the money, they take the money. That's a good point. It's a good point. But the Gemara also says Rabbi Eliezer went into a Beit Midrash, and there was 9 people. He was missing a 10th man. So what did he do? He freed his slave in order to enable the mitzvah of davening, of having a minyan.
Your question was, can you do a small sin to save your friend from a big sin? Very different.
Right, but yeah, good point, Nathan. But saving a big sin is also a mitzvah in a certain sense, that he's not violating the Torah law of baking on Shabbat. So also Tosfos says, right. So first of all, we see, but by the way, we see also the power of a minyan. It's called a mitzvah de rabim, allowing the minyan. Now the question is, was that minyan there for? Maybe was it for Kriyas HaTorah? Of Pasha Zachar. We have to know what's the case. What did they need that minyan for? Was it for regular davening, or was it specifically for a davening of a biblical mitzvah to enable a big old mitzvah of if you hold Zachar needs a minyan? We have to know what that case exactly is that the commentators have to discuss over there. What the case was that they freed the Eved in order to have a minyan of 10 because was it to enable what was the case over there? What was enabling what mitzvah? Was it just regular Kriyat Torah? Was it regular davening minyan, or was it Pasha Zachar? They have to look over there. That's one answer of Tosfot. And another thing of Tosfot is that it could be that when a person was negligent, a person you should have known. Maybe when there's some negligence of something, then we say we're not going to tell someone else to do a sin in order to prevent a bigger sin. But however, when there was something when he was not negligent, then maybe we would go ahead and perhaps, tell someone to do a sin in order to prevent a bigger sin. So back in our Gemara, so the Gemara's question is, this guy who should have known the law or shouldn't have forgot that was Shabbat, he placed it in the oven. So we're not going to go ahead. We're not going to, and if he didn't know about it and someone else knew about it before it was baked, we're not going to tell that guy, you got to take it out. There's no possible part of the side to say you should take it out to prevent your guy from. We're not going to tell someone to sin to prevent his friend from a bigger sin. So the Gemara says, Ela Amar Ravashi. Ravashi says, L'olam b'mezid. Now we are now turning the page, 482. Really, good morning, Asaf. He went ahead and he placed it in the oven, Asaf, intentionally. He was a very bad boy, young man. He put dough in. He allowed his desires of food on Shabbat to overtake him, and he went ahead and he placed dough in the oven on Shabbat intentionally. And then he has regrets. He realized, he got to his senses. What am I doing? Why am I going ahead and placing bread in the oven? Why should I give in to my evil inclination? Do such a big sin? And he wants to go ahead. And now the question is, can he remove the dough now to go ahead and prevent it from reaching a stage of that'll be a biblical obligation, an act that would carry with it the death penalty? Do we say violate the rabbinic prohibition of moving the dough, so it shouldn't reach a level of a sin that's a death penalty sin, or we tell him don't remove the dough? And like we said to Tosfos before, if we're going to stop him from removing the dough and not allow him to remove the dough, he's not going to violate the rabbinic law, and he's also not going to reach, even though it's going to reach baking, but he himself is not going to be obligated death because we tied his hand and we stopped him from removing it. So what does the Gemara say? That's the question. What is the best way to go? Is the best way to go is to no, negative is because you're violating a rabbinic law of removing dough from the oven. He's gonna if
No, not the court prevented it.
Right. Okay, very good. On the other side, if the court is going to prevent it from removing it,
No,
but at the end of the day, he did an act, he's not going to be obligated. That's true, but it's still a very serious offense that was done, that he intentionally placed dough in an oven, which eventually led, as a result of his act, it's true, the court tied his hands, but it was an intentional act of that he started the baking in an intentional way. So he didn't complete it, but it's true, but it's still a very high level sin for a person to start an act intentionally. There's no death penalty.
there's no for starting an act.
Again, there might not be any court penalty, but the act, but the deal, but the question is, what's the worst of the two? Is it worse of the two to violate rabbinic law of removing the dough from the oven, or is it worse to leave this food baked, and at the end of the day, it's gonna be a baking that was done, at least the beginning of the baking was done intentionally on Shabbat. And so that's what the Gemara says, Elam Ravashi, Olam B'mezid, the aim of Kolam Sheva the Isaskila. And when we said before it reaches, it doesn't mean that he's going to come to, and you have to read Rabibi's question, that should we allow him to remove the dough or not? And the question is to prevent a violation that carries that's connected to a stoning of Shabbat, because he started intentionally. So the Gemara says, that he says you will not get, you should tell him to remove it. We tell the guy, Hidbik pat betana, if a guy attached it to the oven, we allow him to remove it before it reaches the level of stoning. Okay, that's the Gemara's conclusion. I want to wish everyone a beautiful day. We'll be back tomorrow. Tomorrow, regular time, 6:45.